If you vote for me, all of your wildest dreams will come true.
Welcome, my friends, to the VFX Promotion Podcast. You'll see it when you believe it. Hello, this is Mark Christensen. When I give a solo talk, I try to imagine who I'm talking to, and I invariably fail at it. When I think about you, I think of you first as a designer, and yet I could easily have been you taking this course and listening to this podcast if they'd been available when I was just starting out. So maybe the best thing to do is talk to myself earlier in my career. See, I don't even take it for granted that you are earlier in your career. I don't know you at all yet, but I certainly look forward to the opportunity to get to know you. But for now, the conversation is a little one-sided. When I was really just getting started out, I had the benefit and the curse of being in a young industry. In the 1990s, everything to do with the computer was exotic. If you had a good web page and a clever URL, you could get venture capital. On the creative side, if you had any artistic talent at all and could handle the technical bullshit involved with those ancient beige boxes we were all stuck on, you had a career. Granted, the guys who mastered Softimage without any sense of timing or how to animate got weeded out, but a lot of the rest of us quickly rose to flashy positions. In my case, a first full-time job for Lucasfilm's interactive division, LucasArts. Now, before I go further, there's something I feel I have to get off my chest. I am an artist, I can design, but I've never been comfortable calling myself a designer, with maybe one exception that I'll get to later. I know, imposter syndrome. All of us creative people get it. But in my case, with design, what I mean is that by rising quickly to be working with some of the best artists around the planet, I came to realize something. There would be guys who would be happy just making cool-looking stuff all day and making it move around. These are the guys who make sound effects when they picture how things are going to animate. That's actually who I would assume you are, and I'm quite possibly wrong about that. Well, that's not me. Now, don't get me wrong, I like making the sounds, and I've made some cool-looking stuff. I'm talking about the kind of designers who love an open brief the most, where the client or whoever has little or no idea what they want or how to ask for it, and these designers just take the thing and rock it and give them more than they could have ever had any right to expect. I'm assuming that's you, and you're slumming in my course, learning about filmmaking and visual effects and so on. Okay, I'm kidding. But since I'm really just talking to an earlier version of myself, a person I now barely know, someone who was very hungry for any information that would help him not feel so anxious about being on a path with no signposts, and that's definitely what it felt like back then, even when my job allowed me to buy a house in San Francisco, I'm going to focus on a few themes and a few received bits of wisdom. Honestly, I have too many to mention, and I really don't want this podcast to be too long. Here's one set of signposts I lacked when I was getting started. Let's say you're a creative person, and all you care about is pursuing a career that lets you flex your creative muscles. That was pretty much me coming out of college. I'd had a second semester senior year internship at no less than Walt Disney Imagineering on Flower Street in Glendale, California. Or should I say sunny Glendale, California. My dad had moved nearby there from San Francisco over a decade before. I was attending a fancy private liberal arts college out in Claremont, and a couple days a week I would spend the night at his place, and I'd be the only person in LA walking to work from his house, the 12 or 15 blocks to Imagineering. The internship totally worked out, and also didn't work out at all. I was in a production office and realized I neither wanted to start in a producer track, nor did I want to live in LA. It felt too disconnected from the earth, which was a weird thing for me to say at the time, but that's actually how I felt. I didn't really say that at the time, I just said it to myself. My only goal, and this will kill you, was to live in San Francisco. I had grown up in a nearby upscale suburb known as Menlo Park, where I swore I never wanted to live again, although many of my childhood pals considered it paradise, and most of them did just fine. Lucky for me, I knew while I was still in this internship that moving to San Francisco was what I wanted, and I said so. And it so happened that I found myself working on casting with one of the most beloved people ever to work at the then fairly young Industrial Light and Magic. Not really young, I mean it started in the 70s, but it was not the company it is today. She gave me one name, and because it was her giving me the name, and because the name she gave me was also a powerhouse and a highly respected woman, this woman, whose name she gave me, continually put me at the top of the pile for production assistant and other positions that were open. At one point, I think I interviewed to be the receptionist. By this time, I had a reel with a little short film I had directed, and at some point, I got an actual call to be a production assistant at freaking Industrial Light and Magic. And it didn't work out, and yet it totally did. I was a failure as a PA for the simple reason that I was bad at paying attention to multiple things at once. I'm better at it now, kinda, but like I said, production was not where I felt like I belonged. One day, we were working on this HP commercial, and I realized I'd left the disc with their logo on it in the vest pocket of my coat in the closet of my apartment on Haight Street in San Francisco. So I actually had to ask for a long lunch break so that I could drive home and get it. The coordinator, whose name was Jackie Lopez, who's now VP of Lucasfilm Animation, just started laughing, which is when I knew I wasn't going to get asked back. Lucky for me, one of my friends had landed a job at LucasArts next door and wanted nothing more than to get his foot in the door at ILM, despite that he was already in a Lucasfilm company. So despite that I knew I was a fraud, he was just calling me all the time, thinking I would get hired back there, I guess. I got a job as an animator on a video game for a tiny little company run out of a guy's basement because I ran a volunteer job hotline. Because after a few months, that one credit involved working with video and green screen composites in, honestly, the crudest way you could possibly do that, I was suddenly the most experienced person LucasArts knew working with full motion video for games, which happened to be what they wanted to get into. Bingo. So now you know two things about me: that I'm an imposter and that I've had a certain amount of luck. Not that I would call working on full motion video for CD-ROM games luck, exactly. Well, it was. Anyway, what I was going to say before I interrupted myself was, let's say you're a creative person, but you don't have that, I don't know, Steven Spielberg single-minded knowledge of exactly what you want to be as a freshman in high school. In fact, I think I did know what I wanted to be, and I didn't think it was possible. But a lot of us do that. So let's say there are 4 arts that can be pursued as money-making careers. This is crass. You hate me for saying it, I know, but let's just put this out there as a hypothesis. So there's design, and there's filmmaking, there's writing, and there's music. Each one of these brings an archetype, okay, stereotype, to mind, but you have to admit, we know, or at least know of, people who do each one of those for a living somewhere. Now I know, there are also fine art painters and ballet dancers and poets and Cirque du Soleil acrobats with amazing careers, but right now I'm talking about the arts that have enough people working in them that they have whole ecosystems and industries of their own, with conferences, communities, forums, the whole bit. The ones where a creative company would have a department to hire these people. For example, Lucasfilm. So there's all this focus on following your passion and also calling bullshit on the whole concept of following your passion. But I would say that at some point, you start to get an idea of things you want to accomplish before you are finished with living. And if you're creative, those take on a certain genre, which at that point could very well be fine art painting. If you're lucky, you clear a path to accomplish those things. Now, I say if you're lucky, but honestly, I think it's more if you're honest with yourself. We are lucky to work as artists, to be certain, and we're certainly lucky to be paid for it. And yet, as a person really much wiser than myself told me, if your greatest fear is that living your dreams will leave you living under a freeway, there's something you're totally failing to grasp. No one ended up living under a freeway by living their dreams. Think about it. One Achilles heel I've had to overcome in my journey is cleverness. If at this point you're thinking, he doesn't sound that clever to me, I thank you for that. I remember thinking when I was starting out that although my energy had always been focused on music and writing, it would be great to follow filmmaking and design early in my career, so later on I would have all those extra skills to build upon. That was really kind of a stupid way of going about it, but it worked out. I did love filmmaking. At LucasArts, I was more a designer, and I ended up in a creative leadership role. In fact, the final project I led there was singled out by Entertainment Weekly as the best of the year in its category. Unfortunately, the name of that category was multimedia, and the following year they no longer even had that category. At that point, I courted work as a creative director at a friend's web design firm. Then the dot-bomb explosion hit, and I was free to admit the web wasn't really my thing. I wanted to work on movies. A year or two later, I would get that chance with a startup some friends from ILM had founded called The Orphanage. Working at The Orphanage was truly the best of times and, yes, the worst of times. But really the best of times. I learned to thrive as a compositor and gained the basis for the course you're in now. Or at least I assume you're in the course. If you're not, and you're so excited about this podcast that you're sharing it with someone you love, awesome. I worked with a group of people so phenomenally gifted, I could almost feel the neurons being built in my brain every day I went there. At one point, they invited me back after we wrapped on a movie they'd hired me for, which was unusual. Very, very few people there actually worked on staff. And that's not what they were offering me. They were just offering me to stick around. I said no because design jobs were calling that earned me 3 times the money. And at this point, I did have 2 kids and a mortgage. And honestly, the days weren't as long. Moreover, there's something I do need to say about filmmaking. I love the world of filmmaking. I love being on set. I loved the garage-like atmosphere and even the smell of Imagineering and ILM when I was coming up through those places. The stages, the machine shops, all these guys who could build stuff like models and robots and film them, and craftspeople. I didn't care that much about seeing my name in movie credits, although my daughter loved bragging to her schoolyard friends about it once I had those. I loved that I was getting away with this career and living in San Francisco. I loved that my business card had basically always said artist on it. But I have to admit, at the end of the day, I wasn't ever really confident that anything I was doing was moving the needle creatively. On a feature film, as proud as I was about the methods and artistry I would bring to finish a shot, I was pretty certain that if I hadn't done the shot, somebody else would. And this was back in the golden era of digital visual effects, when solutions weren't as dialed in and needing to be scalable to the hundreds and thousands as they are today. Even the leads were beholden to the director of the movie, who would at the most drop by now and then, or be on a video transmission. That's what we called video conferencing with a room full of artists. Then came the day when I was having lunch with Dov Rosh at the Ferry Building. Dov had designed the Iron Man heads-up display on the original Iron Man and implemented it in an After Effects Nuke combo pipeline with the help of a gifted technical counterpart named Kyle McCulloch, who went on to become a supervisor at Framestore in London. Kyle did. At lunch, I remember Dov mentioning that the Orphanage would be hearing the next day about whether they would be awarded work on Avatar. Huh. I thought, I'd work on Avatar. Heck yeah. The next day, some news came through. But the news was that the Orphanage was closing its doors immediately and forever due to bankruptcy filing and it was laying off its 100+ workers and many of my friends. Honestly, I'm not even sure Avatar was any nail in the coffin. When employees asked why they hadn't been told that the company was so close to bankruptcy, one of the more honest and transparent founders replied, "We were probably within a day of bankruptcy 17 times during the decade this company was in operation." I did end up working on Avatar with Dov and the orphanage founder, who had been so transparent. A producer on the film had produced Iron Man with them and really wanted to work with them again. So in the middle of the night, they founded a little company just to bid the job, but they scaled it back to provide only FUI design with a crew of less than a dozen people. Again, working in After Effects and Nuke. At this point, though, in late 2009, I was also in a certain amount of trouble. I had always thought the founders of the orphanage would become independently wealthy and gain famous careers doing whatever they wanted to pursue, including directing. I mean, I even used to commute on my bicycle through Presidio Heights, which really I consider to be the ritziest part of San Francisco, thinking, oh yeah, these guys can totally buy one of these mansions one day. Now, one of them did graduate to a directing career, but I, at this point in 2009, saw the writing on the wall. And this was after the bankruptcy. Subsidies were driving VFX work out of California, LA, and the Bay Area. Many friends laid off by the orphanage weren't looking for work in town, but instead in Vancouver or London, where the subsidies had dramatically shifted the business, really shifted it. I had kids. I had always wanted to be in San Francisco, and I had a failing marriage. One thing I realized when I initially thought about how I would do this podcast is that there are topics that have been very significant on my journey that are also triggering for more than a handful of people. So if you were sitting here with me one-on-one, and I could learn some things about you and understand what you wanted to know about personal things like my marriage and how it might relate to your career in design or your life or your filmmaking career, I could happily open up to you about it. Like I said, when I think about talking to an earlier version of myself, I find myself talking to a person who in some ways resembles me a lot, and in other ways who I barely know, or perhaps who I know all too well. What I can say is pretty simple. I can vividly remember working at companies where leaving the studio at 6 p.m. really felt kind of like 4 in the afternoon. Now, as you and I know, those companies still very much exist, and let's face it, they're hard on families. Yes, it's possible that you pay your dues on a given deadline, or for a given period where you have an understanding spouse, and you graduate to a position where you have more control of your life. I've seen people do it. It's also possible that you don't manage to do that, and what was already hard on your family life becomes where you start to put all of your energy because everything else kind of goes out of whack. And with nobody watching over you, and because paid clients keep showing up, and that lets you support your family, you keep working when it's not really working for you. Not creatively, not for your health, not for the joys that family brings. And there's no question the jobs start to not go as well, some of them, because you've turned into a sort of mercenary grinding away at that point, and nobody's telling you otherwise. I did still manage to have some fun and interesting adventures in this period. I started working on independent films and got lucky enough to supervise on a couple that were incredible experiences. Initially, I actually just sent out the wish that I wanted to get out from behind my desk, and no sooner did I wish that than I found myself in the bayou of Louisiana on the set of Beasts of the Southern Wild. This movie would end up recognized in an unexpected trifecta at Sundance, Cannes, and at the Oscars. And the energy on set really indicated that this was a special movie. So I was lucky to have a couple of independent films like that. But it only took a couple others that really didn't go that direction to wake me up to some things. And those are part of what I want to close with. I had to get out of my cage, and I did, by focusing on these things. One was to understand that I'm built like an entrepreneur, probably more than I am like an employee. I say probably, I think it's basically true, but I do like collaboration, and I don't need to be the one always running everything. Now, if this is you, the entrepreneur more than employee, then beware of being in what you know to be a lousy business. This may come as a shock, but as much money as there is in feature visual effects, it's really a terrible business, with average margins in the low single-digit percentages. This tends to come as somewhat of a shock, and it should. Here's a craft that came up in the 1990s, the era when web design, for example, became a fully legitimate business with startups, great profit margins, intelligent, gifted practitioners, valuable intellectual property. Visual effects had all of these, well, not the profit margins, but somehow that was the result of something that went wrong right from the beginning. Somehow the major players in general, and ILM was the most major player, failed to seize the moment when they could have gained a seat at the table in Hollywood. And ever since, the studios have wanted visual effects to be a commodity rather than a craft. Now, again, this is the biggest problem on feature films. That's not to say it's not a problem everywhere, and it's not a rat hole that I'm going to go down right now, but there are plenty of places where one can find great work if that's what you want. Another thing I came to focus on and understand better was that the model of building a nest egg to retirement is, for many of us, broken. And actually, we should be glad about that, in a way. I remember taking my kids to Maui, and we stayed in this beachfront condo. It was mostly populated by orange-skinned retirees. And I got to be frank, they seemed bored, aimless, kind of nattering. And as a community, they were just nothing I ever wanted to be part of. This isn't ageism. This is the vibe. And think about it. These were the winners. Something became clear to me that I had known all along, but now I decided to actually start doing something about it. Rather than working toward some imaginary goal line that depends on circumstances beyond your control to reach and then enjoy, because it depends on reaching your long-distant future and, of course, still having all the means to be enjoying your life, you can invest some of whatever nest egg you have in activities and freedoms you can have today without squandering it. And these are the kind of things you would thank yourself for if you ever got stuck in some condo in Maui, as great as that sounds. And another realization that I started to focus on was that we're all being called to contribute in ways that people really weren't in previous eras. You could surmise from a statement like that we live in the most difficult time, yet there are a couple of obvious problems with thinking that way. One is that clearly there have never been opportunities like the ones that are possible now, right? And the other is that the times in human history where the needs had more to do with pulling together and opening up a mindset that had been limited have actually been the best in which to live by the accounts that I've heard and read of those who were there to live them. My own mindset was fixed, quite fixed, as was that of my family members. A fixed mindset, if you're not familiar with the concept, means that you think you have evidence, let's call it empirical evidence, evidence that you've gathered, of the way that life is. So if at 14 years old, you found yourself thinking you had discovered you're too old to take up the guitar because every guitarist you admired, you looked up and they'd all started when they were 9 or 11, or at least that was their story, then they were already in bands at 14. Well, you have to ask yourself, what are you telling yourself at the age of 70? Our world is suffering from a set of limited mindsets that have become, in some cases, quite pathological, really. We've taken up a profession that is predicated on showing people something, but to really show them something, we need to understand our own fixed mindsets, if indeed we have those. And many of us do. I tried a lot of things, but if they blocked me from greater possibility and freedom, I got away from them, and that has served me well in the long run. The next to last thing I'll talk about before I wrap this up, and that will be soon, could be the first and only topic of the entire discussion, and that is health. The visual effects business was founded by a bunch of people young enough to think they were invincible, basically. They failed in many cases to secure a set of working standards that support good health because they were already blessed with health in the form of youth, and they were really smart. I too had this blessing, and I was fortunate enough to find a number of practices, some of them kind of esoteric by many people's standards, that I followed when my work wasn't supporting it being my health. I'm not going to go into how diet, yoga, cycle commuting, breath and body control, strength training, microdosing, macrodosing, and meditation can transform your path, because it would be a disservice to do all this in a half-baked way. But when in doubt, before you look after your career, money, or even anything beyond meeting the basic needs of family and daily life, I would suggest you focus on practices that support and build your health and well-being, particularly if you can find practices that bring you joy. Because remember, no amount of wealth and prosperity can be enjoyed if you don't have your health. And that brings me to the final thing I'll talk about, which is design. I bet you could teach me as much about this topic as I could teach you, probably more. Not long ago, I found myself in an experience design workshop, and in the introduction period, I realized that the type of design that has always been my focus is experience design, or at least that was always underlying where I put my focus. I realize when you say those words, it connotes what could be called, say, XD, which might be exactly what I'm talking about, or not at all what I'm talking about. What I really mean is that my dream was always to inspire people, and when I found myself in a role that another artist might have interpreted as being about, say, visual design or copywriting, I was always focused on what feeling was being generated for the recipient of what I was creating. To me, the world feels tired of things. People want experiences. Sure, some people want experiences that wouldn't really excite you or me, but more and more people also want to be connected to other people, to spontaneity, to feeling alive, and to something that feels like meaning. One reason that I was really honored and excited to work with School of Motion is that it's creating an experience of learning and practicing the art of motion design that I find to be more inspiring and uniting than what seems to be possible via the other means that I've experienced. Just like with the health topic, there's a lot more I could say about this, but for now, I'm just going to close by saying, I'm glad you're here. Now go do your VFX for Motion homework.